Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1500 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. We will see what my opponent has in store for us. I did a poll on my channel recently asking whether I should keep the intro or not that I just gave, and relatively overwhelmingly was keep it, so we're keeping it. And my opponent goes g6, the modern defense. This could transpose into a Peers defense. Um, but typically everybody plays the move d4 here. And I think I actually had a recent video where my opponent did play like a Peers defense, and I instead like to start with knight c3. My opponent pre-moves bishop to g7 and go bishop to c4. And basically, I'm delaying the commitment to d4 for as long as I possibly can, because I don't really want to do it if I can avoid it, or unless there's a very good reason. And my opponent goes c5, so basically I will not be going pawn to d4, and this actually transposes into kind of like an accelerated dragon Sicilian, except we're playing like a Vienna setup. So instead we'll go pawn to d3. This is very interesting, actually. And this kind of lends itself to some Sicilian theory that I already know, depending on how my opponent plays it. And he goes knight to c6. And this is one of the useful things about my personal opening repertoire, in my opinion, because what I play against the modern defense with this kind of Vienna setup is very similar to what I play against the Sicilian defense with this kind of setup, but including the move a3 for a few reasons. Here, though, we don't necessarily have to throw it in, although, to be honest, I kind of want to throw it in. The whole point is that this bishop gets a hidey hole on a2. So, for example, if I were to play a move like h4, which is a very thematic move, going for pawn to h5, which is obviously trying to play on this g6 hook. A hook is a pawn in like near your king, which, when moved forward, can be used by your opponent to like break open attacking lines, right? So, for example, h4, h5 would threaten something like take to open up the h file. That's a hook. So if we go h4, for example, and my opponent goes knight to h5, then it's like, well, where do I put my bishop? Because if I put it on d5, then I mean it just gets hit with this or this. If I put it here, it just gets hit with this. So I'm actually going to play pawn to a3. And we're going to transpose into one of the main lines in the Sicilian defense that I know very well. So this is kind of funny. And as I said, one of the advantages of my personal opening repertoire, in my opinion, we're gonna go h4. The clear intention is pawn to h5, as I said before. That's a very good move. My opponent may go knight to f6, which exerts more control over h5, which he does. Now h5 doesn't really make sense. Some people might still play it, but after knight takes, rook takes, and pawn takes, some people like going for this exchange sacrifice. You can play queen takes and go after the f7 pawn, sure. After pawn to e6, what's the word? Disconnecting the bishop from f7, I don't really know where our attack is anymore. I mean, we can go knight f3, preparing a move like knight to 2g5, but it's not all that scary. So we're not going to do that. And instead, we have a few options. I quite like knight to h3 in some of these lines, which I think I'm going to play. And it looks like an odd square, because it's like, well, why wouldn't you put the knight on f3? The idea is, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the best move, but I think it's the most aggressive move, is that by putting the knight on f3, we block our queen's access to this diagonal, which obviously could be quite important. A lot of the time, our knight will jump into g5, so in one sense, it doesn't actually matter where we put it. Furthermore, knight f3 is kind of uncomfortable to play, because we can be hit with bishop to g4, pinning the knight, and because our pawn is already committed to the h4 square, we don't have pawn to h3 kicking the bishop, right? And obviously knight to d4 or knight to e5 is probably on the way to put pressure on the knight, and potentially the bishop as well. which is very uncomfortable to deal with. So knight h3 actually makes more sense. Okay, pawn to a6, preparing pawn to b5, so we'll whack the bishop on a2. This is kind of what you do in this opening a lot of the time, is if e6 is played or a6 is played, preparing either d5 or b5, which have tempo on your bishop, you just whack it back on a2. And that's kind of the whole point of this a3 move, to give the bishop this hidey hole. What? Knight d7? Well, obviously we just go pawn to h5. This move makes absolutely zero sense. I really don't understand it. I mean, f5 can't be the intention, surely. And I mean, this is one of the reasons that we put our knight on h3 rather than f3, is so that our queen... No, that's not how queens move. So that our queen has access to the h5 square, right? Now, in fairness, if our knight was on f3, our rook would be watching this anyway. But as I said, bishop g4... Oh my god, I can't draw arrows. Bishop g4 would have been a big problem if this knight was on the f3 square. So this is very, very nice. And now we have a few options. We could take, but after takes, I think we're actually the ones suffering on the h-file, because this rook is well defended and our rook is not defended. So taking is out of the question. Again, if take we can take, that's not a problem. We could push pawn to h6, forcing this bishop to move. If bishop to f8, I mean, great, black can't castle. But also then we shut off the h-file. So I'm actually going to do nothing. I'm not going to touch the h-pawn. We could continue with a few different moves. We could go bishop to g5, applying pressure to the queen, which looks good, and I think I'm going to play it. Knight g5 was also another consideration, potentially going for, like, take, and take sacrifices. But I don't see... I don't know, it doesn't feel like it works. Queen b6 is the move I was expecting. Here, there's a very counterintuitive move, which I believe is probably the best, because it's quite thematic in this opening. And it's rook to b1. And this looks like a very strange construction of the queen side. But it's actually really strong against this fianchetto setup and the queen on b6, because after takes, of course, we take and we get tempo on the queen. The bishop defends the rook. That's very nice. Our queen can also go off and do something else if we want, because normally the queen defends the rook or the knight defends the rook, but obviously the knight can be taken and the queen we might want to move away. But because the bishop is on this weird a2 square, it actually defends the rook very, very well. And that's basically the gist of it. It's actually a really good setup and kind of nullifies these two pieces in terms of their attacks on the queen side. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. And now the question for black is, what is he going to do with his king and what is he going to do with his knight? Because obviously this knight needs to move, because he needs to get this bishop out and he needs to do something with this rook, right? So he has to do something with this knight first. If he comes back to f6, then that would be a game-losing blunder. Dude, my predictions are unreal. My predictions. Actually unreal. Okay, why did I say this is a game-losing blunder? Find the reason why. Find the reason why. Of course, it looks like the most natural move. h6. That just looks like it's game over. And the point is, the bishop loses access to this diagonal because the knight is in the way. The bishop has to drop back to f8, only move, and then we take on f6 because the bishop is no longer defending the knight. There's no good way of dealing with this problem. I assume my opponent saw knight to e5 and was like, well, I'm just going to play f4 and kick him straight back, which is exactly what I would have done, right? Which is another reason we put the knight on h3, by the way, to leave the option of f4 open. And as I said, the main job of this knight on g1, even if it comes to f3 or h3, is to come to the g5 square at some point. So yeah, h6 just looks like it's game over, and my opponent takes it. And now the question is, how do we want to take? Do we want to take the bishop or do we want to take the knight? Well, I'd argue we should take the bishop. It might be slightly more... Oh, whoa, okay. Well, thank you very much. My opponent is imploding on himself. So, yeah, I mean... he's just making my life very easy, isn't he? Let's take the bishop. Yeah, that doesn't do anything. He's just giving me all his pieces. I mean, I could have obviously taken the rook. He's just throwing the game, which is very nice of him. And he resigns. GG. I mean, a relatively quick episode. And seems like it's pretty cut and dry, to be honest. But let's jump into the analysis, see what the computer has to say. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. And yeah, 89.7% accuracy for us, 73.8 for my opponent. Very, very nice. Let's jump into it. So, my opponent starts off with the modern defense with e4 and g6. And like I said, the computer will always recommend the move d4. And then, you know, you'll get positions like this. And, I mean, f4 is a move, bishop e3 is a move. This is, I think, the 160 attack? Something like that. And I mean, it's all very good. Or 150 attack, whatever. But personally, I like to not go d4 because that kind of leads into the sort of theory that my opponent is going to be familiar with. Because if you're going to play the modern defense, the vast majority of players are going to get this kind of position against you. Or knight to f3, right? Like, I'd say 90% of players will go for this against the modern. And that will be what my opponent is booked up on. So I'm not going to do what he wants, obviously. And so in some positions I will play d4, but I like to delay it as much as possible. And instead I go for this Vienna setup, right? And the entire point is to clamp down on the d5 square. And as we saw, my opponent didn't get a chance to play d5. And by playing c5, we transpose into a Sicilian. And I will show you exactly what I mean. So, against the Sicilian, I like to play this a3 line. One of the main lines is g6. And after knight c3, bishop g7, bishop to c4, you will see the stark similarities between this position and this position, right? If I play a3 here, it is exactly the same position, right? You can see this is with bishop c4 on move 4, and this is with a3 on move 4. Exactly the same position, right? I go d3. H4 was also a move immediately. And after h5, white often has ideas of pawn to g4. Although the computer wants queen f3, e6, d4, cd4, knight b5, going after this, d5. Wow, this is very complicated. Very complicated. But we didn't go for any of that. We went d3. Just opening up our bishop, and we get this very typical Vienna setup in the center of the board. My opponent goes knight to c6, and I go pawn to a3, which is a very reasonable move. The computer wants something like bishop to e3 here, but again, that isn't really in the spirit of the sort of Vienna positions that I like to play. So I go a3, giving my bishop an escape route, because I was like, well, if I go h4 now, then I'm a little bit concerned about knight to a5. And the computer actually wants to just give up this bishop. It says this position is very good for white, mainly because we have such good control over the d5 square. And I suppose h5 is on the way, potentially. But I personally don't like giving up my light squared bishop like that. So I go pawn to a3. Now with knight to a5, we just have bishop to a2, and we're doing very well for ourselves. So pawn d6. We go pawn to h4, trying to go pawn to h5. If something like h6, h5, and g5, we can also go for the immediate f4, which is one of the reasons we go d3 to open up the bishop, and the reason we delay knight to f3 and later go knight to h5, is because if this sort of setup is adopted by black, because we don't have the knight on f3 already, we have the ability to go f4 and rip open my opponent's kingside. Very tactical. And I mean, the computer prefers black here, sure. But tell me you want to play this with black. I don't know. I think you'd be a bit mad. So, knight f6. Of course, now h5 doesn't really make sense. After knight here, some people may be tempted to try and go for this line. But it just doesn't really do anything, does it? I mean, the computer likes this. It also likes this. Which actually, yeah, knight e5 is very strong. Because it protects this and hits this. But even a simple move like e6, and it's like, I calculated this line, and I was like, well, we don't really have anything, do we? Like, our attack is done. So we go knight to h3. The computer doesn't love it. It prefers knight d5, which I honestly don't understand. Oh, okay, are we removing the knight from this? Ah, okay, that actually does make sense. That's an interesting thought, but what about e6? Knight f6, queen f6, c3, okay, that's quite typical. Trying to build for a future d4. If castles, then if... oh no, the queen is actually trapped. Oh, c3 stops the queen from coming here? If we go for this immediately... Oh no, b2. Okay, okay. I mean, interesting, but... Anyway, we don't go for any of that. We go knight to h3. The computer preferred knight g to e2. Also liked bishop to a2. Obviously like knight d5. But knight h3 is a very aggressive move, right? As I explained. And I think it paid off for us, right? Pawn a6. The computer wants pawn to h6, which I don't think is very natural at all. It's kind of asking for this sort of idea, which maybe you have pawn g4. But I don't know, this doesn't look that fun to me. Alternatively, you could also play e6, which I think is a more natural move. I would respond with bishop back to a2 most likely. Because like I said, after a6 preparing b5, we drop back so that b5 doesn't come with tempo. Same with e6. I go bishop to a2 so that in the future, d5 doesn't come with tempo. So in some position, for example, let's say black continues building for the move d5. Let's say he goes knight to e7, really insisting on this move. Let's say we go, I don't know, for the sake of argument, knight g5, and d5 is played. Well, then the point is the bishop isn't under attack. So we go e5, right? We're under no obligation to take or move our bishop out of the way. We go d5, and then we can play a move like f4, and we can squeeze the black position. And I mean, black can get into a lot of trouble very quickly, potentially, with something like this, right? You can see how this is a stupidly aggressive setup from us. And when you're attacking, you typically want to keep the center closed. That's a good rule of thumb, because it restricts pieces' ability to move around the board and get to the king's defense. So pawn a6, we drop the bishop back. Knight d7 is just a mistake. Terrible move, to be honest. The computer wants to do this? Really? And then go e6. Okay, and after this, what, h6? Bishop back. Okay, interesting. Knight d7 is just a terrible move because it takes the knight's eyes off of the h5 square. Taking makes no sense. We can take back, and you can see how we have so many attacking pieces. This is just unsustainable. And also, we're obviously threatening mate, right? The bishop on a2 is just a sniper. So, knight d7, h5. My opponent goes e6, which is the best move, disconnecting the bishop from f7. We go bishop g5, hitting the queen, and basically forcing black to go queen b6, in which case I go rook b1, which is somehow a mistake. Okay, I mean, try and find the best move here for white. Try and find the best move for white. You're not going to find it. If you do, I mean, congrats, but, like, I wouldn't recommend playing in the way the computer suggests, because it wants bishop c1. I mean, what? Obviously, I'm not going to play that. So rook b1, calls it a mistake. I don't think it really is. The only reason it thinks it's a mistake is because it allows h6 with tempo on the bishop and then g5, locking things up, which obviously makes sense. And I mean, if we go f4, it wants to take, which again looks so strange. So strange. Rook g8, queen d2, knight e5, giving this up. But then you would win g2, so, like, maybe you can justify this. Yeah. Yeah, I probably wouldn't go for that line. But an interesting position. However, my opponent, of course, goes knight to f6, which I think the reason... Because I was looking at this position, and I was like, right, black shouldn't touch anything on the king's side. That's the way that I was thinking. Because I was like, well, if I ever take, then after takes, black is actually doing very well. So let's say in this position I were to take, you can see the evaluation swings in black's favor. This opens up for black, not for white, open for black, because black is the one controlling the file. This knight is pinned to my rook, and my rook is undefended, right? So I was like, okay, black probably shouldn't do anything on the king side, And he should probably try and finish up his development. And I mean, anything but h6 is terrible for black here, really. I mean, the computer wants queen a5 to try and do this. But I mean, we can actually encourage that, apparently. And then give up 2 pawns. And then the queen is basically trapped anyway. And c4 is the only move. But, okay. I think that black basically was like, knight e5 is no good because of pawn to f4. Although h6 immediately is better because, again, the computer thinks black can counterattack with h6, forcing the bishop away, which does make sense. For knight f6, we have pawn to h6, the bishop takes, and we take on h6. We could take here, but the computer prefers taking the bishop because black can actually castle, interestingly. And I mean, it's obviously completely lost. Something like this, and we're just going to barrel through the position. We're already up a piece, but we take on h6, e5 allows bishop g7, bishop h3, of course we take back, knight g4, we obviously take, and I mean my opponent just gives up and resigns in this position. So yeah, a very interesting game, kind of like a modern defense, and then a Vienna, and then an a3 Sicilian, like. But the fact that my opening repertoire is very similar across many openings, it allowed me to navigate the position with a good level of familiarity, in my opinion. So, hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you learned a lot. If you want to see another game in the A3 Sicilian, check out the video up here. And if you want to see, oh my god, if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.